The bitter Montana wind howled across the snow-covered peaks of Cedar Falls, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a storm. In the fading light of winter dusk, a figure stood motionless beside an old grain silo, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Jessica Martinez, 24 years old with piercing green eyes and calloused hands, watched three shadows moving through the twilight toward her twin sister. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 50 yards away, Rebecca Martinez knelt in the snow, her art supplies scattered around her like broken dreams. Her canvas, once pristine white, now bore streaks of red that weren't paint. Kyle Richardson and his two cronies, Walsh and Brandon Cooper, circled her like wolves, their voices carrying cruel laughter across the frozen landscape. They had no idea they had just awakened something far more dangerous than the Montana wilderness itself. Because Jessica Martinez wasn't just another rancher's daughter trying to make ends meet on the family cattle operation. She was a ghost story whispered in the darkest corners of military intelligence, a legend known only by her code name, Phantom. And these small-town bullies had just made the final mistake of their miserable lives. The Martinez Ranch had been carved out of the unforgiving Montana wilderness 3 generations ago, when Jessica and Rebecca's great-grandfather arrived with nothing but determination and a dream of raising cattle beneath the endless sky. The ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of rolling hills and pine forests, where the Continental Divide cast its shadow over valleys that had remained unchanged for centuries. Cedar Falls itself was barely a town, just a collection of weathered buildings clustered around Highway 2, with a population that barely cracked 800 souls. The Martinez twins had grown up as different as night and day, despite sharing the same dark hair and olive complexion inherited from their mother's side. Rebecca was the artist, the dreamer who saw beauty in the way morning frost clung to fence posts and found inspiration in the dance of aurora borealis across the northern sky. She spent her evenings in the converted barn that served as her studio, painting landscapes that captured the raw majesty of their mountain home. Her canvases told stories of solitude and wonder, each brushstroke a whisper of the sensitive soul that beat within her chest. Jessica, however, had always been drawn to action and adventure. While Rebecca painted sunsets, Jessica was tracking deer through dense timber. While her sister mixed colors on her palette, Jessica was learning to handle firearms and mastering the art of survival in terrain that could kill the unprepared without warning. Their parents, Maria and Robert Martinez, had watched their daughters grow along these divergent paths with a mixture of pride and concern, never suspecting that Jessica's restless spirit would eventually lead her far from the safety of their mountain sanctuary. It was Rebecca's gentle nature that made her a target for the cruelty that seemed to fester in small towns like a poison. Kyle Richardson was the ringleader, a 19-year-old dropout whose father's badge gave him immunity from consequences. Sheriff Tom Richardson had ruled Cedar Falls with an iron fist for over 2 decades, and his son had grown up believing that power meant the right to terrorize anyone weaker than himself. Walsh and Brandon Cooper were his eager disciples, young men with empty futures who found purpose in Kyle's twisted games. They called Rebecca names that cut deeper than any blade, mocking her art as worthless scribbles and her quiet manner as weakness. They would corner her after school, steal her paintings, and leave her supplies broken in the snow. The 3 of them fed off her fear like parasites, growing bolder with each passing week as they realized that nobody in Cedar Falls was willing to stand up to the sheriff's son. What they didn't know was that Jessica had been gone from Cedar Falls for 6 long years, and the young woman who had returned was forged from steel and shadow. At 18, she had vanished from the ranch without explanation, leaving behind only a note that promised she would return when she was ready. The townspeople had whispered about her disappearance, some claiming she had run off to join the circus, others suggesting she had gotten herself into trouble with the wrong crowd. A few suspected the military, but even they couldn't have imagined the truth. The United States Navy SEALs were the elite of the elite, warriors trained to operate in the most hostile environments on Earth. Jessica Martinez had endured the crucible of basic underwater demolition training, where grown men were broken down and rebuilt into living weapons. She had earned her trident the hard way, through months of torture that tested every fiber of her being. The instructors had pushed her beyond human limits, forcing her to confront her deepest fears while swimming through underwater obstacle courses and carrying telephone poles across endless beaches until her hands bled and her lungs burned. But Jessica hadn't just survived the training. She had excelled at it, earning recognition as one of the most naturally gifted operatives her instructors had ever encountered. Her code name, Phantom, was earned through her uncanny ability to move unseen through enemy territory, striking targets with surgical precision before melting back into the shadows like smoke. She had spent 4 years conducting classified operations across 3 continents, dismantling terror networks and eliminating high-value targets in places that didn't appear on any map. Her missions had taken her deep into the mountains of Afghanistan, where she had spent weeks tracking Taliban commanders through terrain that would have challenged even the most experienced mountaineers. She had infiltrated arms-dealing networks in Eastern Europe, posing as a buyer while gathering intelligence that would later topple entire criminal organizations. In the deserts of Iraq, she had provided overwatch for extraction operations, her rifle ensuring that her teammates made it home alive even when everything went wrong. The psychological toll of such work was immense, and Jessica had seen too many good operators burn out or break under the weight of what they were asked to do. She had made the decision to leave active duty after her final mission in Syria, where she had been forced to eliminate a target in circumstances that haunted her dreams. The official records would show that Petty Officer Martinez had been honorably discharged after suffering injuries in a training accident, but the truth was that Jessica had simply reached the point where she needed to remember what it felt like to be human again. Returning to Cedar Falls had been like stepping back into a previous life, one that felt both familiar and strange after her years in the shadows. The mountains were exactly as she remembered them, eternal and unchanging, but she found that she saw them now through different eyes. Every ridge line was a potential sniper position. Every stand of trees could conceal an ambush. Every stranger might be.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Carrying concealed weapons. The habits of survival were not easily abandoned, even in the peaceful wilderness of her childhood. Jessica had thrown herself into ranch work with characteristic intensity, helping her aging parents maintain the sprawling operation that had been her family's legacy for generations. She repaired fences that had been damaged by winter storms, worked alongside the hired hands during calving season, and spent long hours on horseback checking the herds that grazed in the high pastures. The physical labor was therapeutic in a way that no amount of counseling could have achieved, reconnecting her with the simple rhythms of life that she had almost forgotten during her years of warfare. But she had also remained vigilant, unable to fully shake the habits that had kept her alive in places where relaxation meant death. She noticed things that others missed, details that spoke of potential threats or unusual activities. It was this heightened awareness that first alerted her to the systematic harassment that Rebecca was enduring at the hands of Kyle Richardson and his followers. Jessica had been working in the equipment barn when she first heard her sister crying, the sound carrying across the yard like a physical blow. She had found Rebecca huddled in her studio, her latest painting destroyed, the canvas slashed beyond repair. The tears streaming down her sister's face had ignited something primal within Jessica, a protective fury that she recognized from her darkest missions overseas. She had held Rebecca close, feeling her sister's body shake with suppressed sobs, and had sworn a silent oath that such a scene would never be repeated. The investigation that followed was conducted with the same methodical precision that Jessica had once applied to hunting terrorists in foreign lands. She identified Kyle Richardson as the primary threat, cataloging his patterns of behavior, his associates, and his preferred methods of intimidation. She learned about his father's corrupt influence over local law enforcement, the way complaints against Kyle seemed to disappear into administrative black holes. She discovered that Rebecca was not his only victim, that other vulnerable residents of Cedar Falls had suffered under his reign of terror with no recourse to justice. Jessica had considered various approaches to resolving the situation, ranging from direct confrontation to more subtle forms of persuasion. Her training had taught her that violence should always be the last resort, that intelligence and patience could often achieve results that brute force could not. She had hoped that Kyle would eventually lose interest in tormenting Rebecca, that he might find other targets or simply grow out of his cruel tendencies as he matured into adulthood. Those hopes were shattered on the evening when everything changed forever, when the last vestiges of Jessica's civilian identity were stripped away by the sound of her sister's terrified scream echoing across the frozen landscape. She had been checking the cattle in the north pasture when the cry reached her ears, carried on the wind like a distress signal from hell itself. Every instinct honed through years of combat training had fired simultaneously, flooding her system with adrenaline and focusing her mind on the singular purpose that had defined her military career: neutralize the threat and protect the innocent. Jessica had abandoned her horse and sprinted toward the sound, her boots finding purchase on the icy ground with the sure-footed grace of someone who had learned to run across rooftops in Mogadishu and navigate mountain passes in the Hindu Kush. Grain silo came into view through the gathering dusk, its cylindrical silhouette stark against the darkening sky. What she saw there would have challenged the restraint of a saint, much less a woman trained to eliminate enemies of the United States with extreme prejudice. Rebecca was on her knees in the snow, her art supplies scattered in a wide circle around her as if they had been thrown by an explosion. Her canvas, which had been intended as a winter landscape capturing the beauty of fresh snowfall, was now torn and trampled into the frozen ground. Kyle Richardson stood over her like a conquering general, his face twisted with the kind of cruel satisfaction that Jessica had seen before on the faces of war criminals and terrorists. Derek Walsh and Brandon Cooper flanked him, their laughter sharp and vicious as they took turns kicking snow and debris at Rebecca's huddled form. The scene triggered something deep within Jessica's psyche, a combat mindset that transformed her from concerned sister into lethal operator in the span of a heartbeat. Time seemed to slow as her training took over, her mind automatically assessing threats, calculating angles of attack, and formulating tactical responses with machine-like precision. She noted Kyle's positioning, the distance between herself and the targets, the terrain features that could provide cover or concealment. Most importantly, she evaluated the threat level and determined that while the situation was serious, it did not yet warrant lethal force. Jessica's approach was silent and deliberate, her movements flowing with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to move without being detected. She used the natural contours of the landscape to mask her advance, staying low and taking advantage of every shadow and depression in the snow-covered ground. Kyle and his companions were so focused on their victim that they never noticed the predator stalking them through the gathering darkness, never sensed the danger that was closing in on them like the jaws of a trap. When Jessica finally revealed herself, it was with the controlled fury of a winter storm breaking over the mountains. Her voice cut through the cold air like a blade, each word precisely enunciated and weighted with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The three tormentors froze in place, their crude laughter dying in their throats as they turned to face this new presence that had materialized from the shadows like an avenging spirit. Kyle Richardson had never encountered anything like Jessica Martinez in his sheltered life of small-town privilege and inherited authority. He saw a young woman in ranch clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her boots and jeans bearing the honest dirt of hard work. What he failed to recognize were the subtle signs that would have been obvious to anyone with military experience. The perfect balance of her stance, the way her hands remained loose and ready at her sides, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in her green eyes. His response was predictable, a combination of wounded male pride and genuine bewilderment at being challenged by someone he perceived as beneath his status in the local hierarchy. Kyle had grown up believing that his father's badge made him untouchable, that the residents of Cedar Falls existed solely for his entertainment and abuse. The idea that this ranch girl would dare to confront him was so foreign to his worldview that he literally couldn't process it at first. When Kyle finally found his voice, it came out as a sneer filled with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He demanded to know who Jessica thought she was, talking to him like that. He reminded her that his father was the sheriff, that she was nobody special, just another dirt-poor rancher's daughter trying to act tough. His words were designed to intimidate and humiliate, tactics that had worked countless times before against other victims who lacked the power or courage to fight back. But Jessica Martinez was not like other victims Kyle Richardson had encountered. She listened to his threats with the patient attention of someone cataloging intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. When he finished his tirade, she responded with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Was he planning to continue hurting her sister? Or was this conversation going to end with him walking away and never bothering Rebecca again? The directness of her approach seemed to confuse Kyle, who was accustomed to victims who begged and pleaded rather than negotiating from a position of apparent strength. He glanced at Derek and Brandon, seeking reassurance from his followers, then turned back to Jessica with renewed aggression. His next words would prove to be the fatal mistake that transformed the tense confrontation into a demonstration of why certain people should never be underestimated. Kyle Richardson made the choice to escalate to physical violence, lunging forward with the clumsy aggression of someone who had only ever fought opponents weaker than himself. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Cedar Falls, whispered about in hushed tones whenever the conversation turned to the night when everything changed at the old grain silo. Jessica's response was instantaneous and devastatingly effective, a display of combat prowess that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Kyle's charge was redirected with a hip throw that sent him sprawling into the snow with bone-jarring impact. Derek's attempt to blindside her resulted in him finding himself face down in the frozen ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that left him gasping for breath and begging for mercy. Brandon's contribution to the fight lasted exactly 3 seconds, ending when Jessica's elbow found his solar plexus and dropped him to his knees, retching and struggling to remain conscious. The entire encounter was over before any of the 3 attackers fully understood what had happened to them. They found themselves immobilized in the snow, their bodies racked with pain from techniques they had never seen before, staring up at a young woman who showed no signs of exertion or emotional disturbance despite having just dismantled 3 opponents with surgical precision. Jessica's final words to Kyle Richardson were delivered in the same calm, professional tone she had once used when interrogating captured terrorists in overseas detention facilities. She explained with perfect clarity that any future harassment of her sister would result in consequences far more severe than what he had just experienced. She suggested that he might want to consider finding new hobbies, perhaps something that didn't involve terrorizing innocent people who had never done anything to deserve his attention. The walk home across the darkened ranch was conducted in silence, Jessica's arm around Rebecca's shoulders as they made their way back to the warmth and safety of the family house. Rebecca was shaking, but whether from cold, shock, or relief, Jessica couldn't tell. What mattered was that her sister was safe, that the immediate threat had been neutralized, and that Kyle Richardson now understood there would be consequences if he chose to continue his campaign of harassment. But Jessica's years of experience in asymmetric warfare had taught her that eliminating one threat often led to the emergence of others, that bullies and tyrants rarely accepted defeat gracefully. She suspected that Kyle Richardson would not simply accept this humiliation and move on with his life, that his wounded pride and family connections would drive him to seek revenge through other means. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly that revenge would manifest, or how far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls the consequences would ultimately reach. The Martinez family ranch was about to become the center of a conflict that would test everything Jessica had learned during her years as a Navy SEAL, forcing her to confront not only the corrupt power structure of her hometown, but also dangerous enemies from her classified past who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opportunity to emerge from the shadows. Part 2. The Catalyst Event. The morning after the confrontation at the grain silo dawned gray and bitter, with storm clouds gathering over the peaks of the Continental Divide like an army preparing for battle. Jessica Martinez stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, nursing a cup of black coffee while watching the weather build to the west. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through tactical assessments and threat analyses with the relentless precision of a computer program designed for warfare. The encounter with Kyle Richardson had been resolved with minimal force, but her instincts warned her that the situation was far from over. Rebecca sat at the wooden kitchen table that had belonged to their great-grandmother, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate as if drawing warmth from more than just the beverage. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, painting stark reminders of Kyle's cruelty across her delicate features. Her art supplies, those that had survived the destruction at the grain silo, were arranged in neat piles before her like the remnants of a battlefield. She had salvaged what she could from the snow, but several brushes were snapped beyond repair, and her favorite palette knife bore deep scratches that would never fully heal. Maria Martinez moved between her daughters with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had raised a family in the unforgiving wilderness of Montana. Her weathered hands, strong from decades of ranch work, prepared breakfast with mechanical precision while her dark eyes flicked constantly between Jessica and Rebecca, reading the unspoken tensions that crackled in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. She had seen Jessica return from her mysterious 6-year absence, changed in ways that went far deeper than physical maturation. And now she was witnessing firsthand the protective instincts that her eldest daughter had learned to channel with deadly precision. Robert Martinez entered the kitchen with snow still clinging to his boots, having completed the morning feeding routine that began every day before dawn regardless of weather or circumstance. His face bore the deep lines carved by decades of sun and wind, and his hands showed the permanent stains of engine oil and cattle, medicine that marked him as a man who worked with his hands for a living. He paused in the doorway, his experienced eyes taking in the tableau before him with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately. The family breakfast proceeded in relative silence, punctuated only by the scraping of silverware against ceramic plates and the occasional crack of settling timber as the old house adjusted to the temperature fluctuations of the mountain morning. Jessica ate methodically, fueling her body with the same deliberate care she had once applied to preparing for combat missions. Rebecca picked at her food, her appetite suppressed by a combination of physical discomfort and emotional turmoil. The events of the previous evening had shattered her sense of security in a way that would take time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. It was Maria who finally broke the silence, her voice carrying the weight of maternal concern mixed with practical ranch wisdom. She had witnessed the aftermath of Kyle Richardson's harassment campaign for weeks, watching her sensitive younger daughter withdraw further into herself with each passing day. The art that had once flowed from Rebecca's brushes with joyful abandon had become increasingly dark and troubled, reflecting an inner turmoil that no parent should have to watch their child endure. Now, seeing Jessica's protective instincts fully activated, Maria understood that the situation had reached a tipping point from which there might be no peaceful retreat. She spoke directly to Jessica, her words carefully chosen but weighted with implications and extended far beyond their immediate meaning. She acknowledged that Kyle Richardson had needed to be stopped, that his behavior toward Rebecca had crossed lines that no civilized person should tolerate. But she also expressed concern about the potential consequences of confronting the sheriff's son so directly, particularly given the Richardson family's stranglehold on local law enforcement and their history of retaliating against anyone who dared to challenge their authority. Robert's contribution to the conversation revealed the depth of his understanding about the corrupted power structure that governed Cedar Falls. He had lived in the community for over 30 years, watching Tom Richardson transform from an ambitious young deputy into a petty tyrant who used his badge to intimidate anyone who opposed his will. The sheriff had cultivated relationships with federal agencies, claiming credit for drug busts and immigration enforcement actions that had actually been conducted by outside forces. His political connections extended to the state capitol, where he was regarded as a reliable vote on law and order issues, despite his questionable methods of maintaining that order. Kyle Richardson was widely known throughout the county as a problem that nobody seemed able or willing to address through official channels. Complaints against him had a habit of disappearing into administrative limbo. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia when pressed for details, and victims often found themselves facing counter-charges that complicated their lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. The unspoken understanding was that crossing the Richardson family meant accepting consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate conflict, potentially affecting everything from business licenses to property tax assessments to the mysterious delays that could plague any citizen unfortunate enough to require county services. Jessica listened to her parents' concerns with the patient attention of someone accustomed to receiving intelligence briefings about complex operational environments. She understood their fears, recognized the validity of their warnings, and appreciated the love that motivated their attempts to protect both of their daughters from further harm. But she also possessed knowledge about conflict resolution that extended far beyond the civilian experience of small-town politics, hard-won expertise acquired in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than social standing. Her response was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging the risks while making it clear that she was not prepared to allow Rebecca to continue suffering under Kyle's campaign of intimidation. She had seen what happened in communities where bullies were allowed to operate without consequences, how the cancer of unchecked aggression metastasized until it poisoned everything it touched. The techniques she had learned for dealing with insurgents and terrorists could be adapted for handling domestic threats, though the rules of engagement were obviously different when operating on American soil among civilian populations. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching the ranch house, its engine note carrying clearly across the snow-covered landscape in the still morning air. Jessica's body language shifted almost imperceptibly, her posture straightening as her senses sharpened to full combat readiness. Through the kitchen window, she could see a black pickup truck making its way up the gravel driveway, moving slowly and deliberately like a predator stalking its prey. The vehicle was unfamiliar, but the aggressive manner of its approach triggered warning bells that had kept her alive through countless dangerous encounters in foreign lands. The truck came to a stop in the yard between the house and the main barn, positioned in a way that would make rapid departure difficult for anyone inside the residence. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training. They were not locals. That much was immediately obvious from their clothing, their bearing, and the professional manner in which they surveyed their surroundings before approaching the house. Jessica's mind began cataloging details automatically: approximate ages, physical builds, potential weapons, escape routes, defensive positions. The leader of the group was a tall man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh climates and dangerous situations. His companions were younger, both appearing to be in their late 20s or early 30s, with the lean builds and alert expressions of men accustomed to violence. All three wore civilian clothing, but their boots were military issue, and the way they moved suggested familiarity with tactical formations and small unit operations. Robert Martinez answered the door, his natural hospitality warring with the caution that came from living in an isolated location where unexpected visitors were rare and potentially dangerous. The strangers identified themselves as federal investigators, displaying credentials that appeared legitimate, but which Jessica's trained eye recognized as potentially sophisticated forgeries. They claimed to be following up on reports of unusual activity in the area, suggesting that someone had been conducting unauthorized surveillance or intelligence-gathering operations that had attracted the attention of national security agencies. The questions they asked were carefully constructed to appear routine while actually probing for specific information about Jessica's background and current activities. They inquired about any visitors to the ranch, any communications with individuals outside the local area, any activities that might have seemed unusual or out of character for a typical ranching operation. The leader's eyes moved constantly as he spoke, taking in details about the interior of the house, the family dynamics, and particularly Jessica's reactions to their presence. Jessica recognized the interrogation techniques being employed, having used similar methods herself when gathering intelligence about potential threats in hostile territories. The seemingly casual questions were designed to elicit information that could be cross-referenced against existing databases, building a picture of her activities and associations that could reveal compromising details about her classified past. The timing of their arrival, less than 12 hours after her confrontation with Kyle Richardson, suggested that her presence in Cedar Falls had been flagged by monitoring systems that she had hoped to avoid. Her response was carefully calibrated to provide minimal information while appearing cooperative and innocent. She acknowledged her recent return to the family ranch after several years away, describing her absence in vague terms that could apply to any number of civilian pursuits. When pressed for specifics about her previous employment, she mentioned restaurant work in various cities, temporary jobs that left minimal paper trails and required no special skills or training. Her story was plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry while providing no useful intelligence to anyone conducting deeper investigation. The federal agents spent nearly an hour at the ranch, their questions growing more specific and pointed as they realized that Jessica was not going to provide the information they were seeking. They made subtle threats about the consequences of obstructing federal investigations, hinted at surveillance capabilities that could monitor activities across vast rural areas, and suggested that cooperation would be in everyone's best interests. But they also seemed aware that they were operating without solid legal authority, fishing for information rather than conducting an official investigation with proper warrants and judicial oversight. When they finally departed, Jessica watched their vehicle disappear down the mountain road while her mind raced through the implications of their unexpected visit. The fact that federal attention had been drawn to her location so quickly suggested that her identity had been compromised, possibly through database queries triggered by Kyle Richardson's father reaching out to law enforcement contacts for assistance in dealing with the mysterious ranch girl who had humiliated his son. Alternatively, her presence might have been detected through ongoing monitoring of individuals with classified backgrounds, routine surveillance designed to track former special operations personnel who might pose security risks. The afternoon brought fresh challenges as word of the previous evening's confrontation spread through the close-knit community of Cedar Falls like wildfire through dry timber. The story grew and mutated with each retelling, transformed from a brief scuffle into an epic battle that painted Jessica as everything from a martial arts expert to a dangerous fugitive with mysterious government connections. The local gossip network, fueled by social media and small-town boredom, ensured that every resident of the county would hear some version of the events before sunset. Rebecca's attempt to continue her normal routine was derailed when she encountered hostile reactions from classmates and teachers who had heard various versions of the grain silo incident. Some viewed Jessica's intervention as heroic, long overdue justice delivered to a bully who had terrorized the community for years without consequences. Others saw it as an unwarranted assault on the sheriff's son, an attack on local authority that threatened the delicate social order that kept their small community functioning. The polarization was immediate and intense, dividing the town into armed camps that viewed the Martinez family as either heroes or dangerous outsiders. Kyle Richardson's response to his humiliation was swift and predictable, following the classic pattern of bullies whose authority has been successfully challenged. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions or seeking to make amends for his harassment of Rebecca, he chose to escalate the conflict by involving his father's official authority. His version of events painted him as the victim of an unprovoked assault by a dangerous individual with possible terrorist connections, claims that his father was all too willing to accept without questioning the credibility of the source. Sheriff Tom Richardson's investigation into the grain silo incident was conducted with the thoroughness of a man determined to find evidence supporting predetermined conclusions. He interviewed witnesses who hadn't actually witnessed anything, collected statements from individuals who had heard fourth-hand accounts of the confrontation, and built a case file that portrayed Jessica Martinez as a clear and present danger to public safety. His deputies canvassed the area around the grain silo, photographing footprints in the snow and collecting what they claimed was evidence of assault and battery. The sheriff's political connections proved useful in legitimizing his version of events, as he reached out to federal contacts who were already interested in Jessica's activities for entirely different reasons. The convergence of local law enforcement, concerns with national security interests, created a perfect storm of official attention that threatened to expose Jessica's classified background while simultaneously painting her as a domestic terrorist threat. The irony was not lost on her that the skills she had developed in service to her country were now being used to justify treating her as an enemy of the state. Evening brought a temporary respite from the escalating tensions, as the Martinez family gathered in the living room of their ranch house to discuss the rapidly deteriorating situation. The wood-burning stove cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the cold reality of their circumstances. Jessica found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain aspects of her past that she had hoped to keep buried forever, walking the fine line between honesty and operational security that had governed her interactions with civilian populations throughout her military career. She described her naval service in general terms, acknowledging special operations training without revealing the specific nature of her missions or the classified capabilities she had developed. Her parents listened with growing understanding as they realized that their daughter's 6-year absence had transformed her into something far different from the adventurous young woman who had left their ranch in search of purpose and direction. The skills she had displayed at the grain silo were not the product of casual martial arts training, but rather the result of intensive preparation for warfare against America's most dangerous enemies. Rebecca's reaction to these revelations was complex, mixing pride in her sister's service with concern about the implications for their family's safety. She had always known that Jessica was protective, but understanding the depth of training and experience behind that protectiveness was both reassuring and frightening. The knowledge that her twin possessed the ability to eliminate threats with lethal precision was comforting in one sense, but it also highlighted the seriousness of their current situation in ways that made peaceful resolution seem increasingly unlikely. The family's discussion was interrupted by a phone call that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Sheriff Richardson's voice carried clearly through the speaker, his tone mixing official authority with personal vindictiveness as he informed Jessica that she was wanted for questioning in connection with an assault investigation. He made it clear that voluntary cooperation would be appreciated, but was not required, and that failure to appear at the county sheriff's office within 24 hours would result in the issuance of arrest warrants that would be served with whatever force was deemed necessary. Jessica's response was calm and professional, acknowledging the sheriff's request while making no commitments about compliance with his demands. She understood that appearing voluntarily would place her in a vulnerable position where she could be held indefinitely while investigations proceeded at whatever pace served the Richardson family's interests. On the other hand, failure to cooperate would provide justification for escalating law enforcement response that could endanger her family and potentially expose classified information about her background. The phone call ended with an implicit threat that left no doubt about Sheriff Richardson's intentions. He was not interested in conducting an impartial investigation into the grain silo incident, but rather in using his official authority to punish the Martinez family for daring to challenge his son's reign of terror. The corruption that had been allowed to fester in Cedar Falls for decades was finally being exposed to daylight, but the process of bringing justice to the community would require sacrifices that Jessica was not sure her family was prepared to make. Part 3. The Intrigue Hook. The ancient grandfather clock in the Martinez living room chimed midnight, its resonant notes echoing through the darkened house like a funeral bell, tolling for the peaceful life that Jessica had hoped to rebuild among the familiar comforts of her childhood home. She sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the detritus of a hastily consumed meal and the scattered remnants of family photographs that told the story of happier times, when the world beyond their mountain valley had seemed safely distant and manageable. Her laptop computer, a piece of equipment that would have seemed out of place in the rustic ranch house to any casual observer, glowed with the blue light of encrypted communications that connected her to a network of contacts she had hoped never to need again. The messages arriving through secure channels painted a picture of rapidly escalating danger that extended far beyond the petty tyranny of Sheriff Richardson and his spoiled son. Federal databases had been queried using variations of Jessica's name and known aliases, suggesting that multiple agencies were now taking an active interest in her presence in Cedar Falls. Facial recognition algorithms had flagged security camera footage from the grain silo area, though the rural location's limited surveillance infrastructure had prevented clear identification. Most concerning of all, communications intercepts had detected references to Phantom being discussed by individuals whose true identities remained classified at levels that even Jessica's previous clearance had not been authorized to access. The irony of her situation was not lost on someone who had spent years operating in the shadows of international conflict zones, where the line between ally and enemy shifted with the political winds of nations whose interests rarely aligned with justice or morality. She had returned to Montana seeking the simple clarity of ranch life, where problems could be solved through honest work and straightforward communication rather than the Byzantine complexity of covert operations conducted in the gray areas between warfare and diplomacy. Instead, she found herself trapped in a web of corruption and conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything she had fought to protect during her years of service to her country. The secure communication system that Jessica had accessed represented technology that officially did not exist, quantum encrypted channels developed for special operations personnel who needed to maintain contact with command structures while operating in denied territories where traditional communications would compromise their missions. The fact that these channels remained active despite her separation from military service suggested that certain elements within the defense establishment viewed her as an ongoing asset rather than a retired veteran entitled to civilian privacy. This realization carried implications that extended far beyond her current difficulties with local law enforcement. Among the messages waiting in her encrypted inbox was a communication from Colonel David Stone, her former handler during the most sensitive missions of her Navy SEAL career. Stone's message was brief and cryptic, written in the kind of operational shorthand that could convey complex information while appearing innocuous to anyone lacking the proper context for interpretation. He warned that old friends were taking an interest in her current activities, that vacation plans might need to be accelerated, and that family obligations should be carefully considered in light of changing circumstances. The translation of Stone's coded language was chilling in its implications. The old friends were undoubtedly former targets of Jessica's operations, individuals or organizations with the resources and motivation to seek revenge against the operative, known as Phantom. The suggestion that vacation plans might need acceleration was a recommendation that she consider immediate extraction from her current location, abandoning her family to whatever fate awaited them in order to preserve operational security and prevent her own capture or elimination. The reference to family obligations was perhaps most disturbing, as it implied that her presence in Cedar Falls had already compromised her relatives' safety in ways that might require drastic action to address. Jessica's training in operational security had prepared her for the possibility that her classified past might eventually catch up with her civilian life, but she had believed that careful preparation and years of maintaining a low profile would provide adequate protection for herself and her family. The speed with which her cover had been blown suggested either catastrophic failures in security protocols or deliberate betrayal by individuals with access to the most sensitive compartments of her service record. Either possibility carried implications that extended far beyond her personal safety, potentially compromising ongoing operations and endangering other personnel whose lives depended on the integrity of classification systems. The second secure message in her inbox originated from an encryption key that Jessica recognized but had hoped never to see again. Anton Volkov had been one of her primary targets during her final deployment, an arms dealer whose network supplied weapons to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Jessica's mission had been to infiltrate his organization, gather intelligence about his operations, and facilitate his capture by multinational law enforcement agencies. The operation had been successful, resulting in Volkov's arrest and the seizure of weapon stockpiles that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians if they had reached their intended destinations. Volkov's message was written in English, but its phrasing and syntax clearly reflected the speech patterns of someone for whom the language was not native. He began by acknowledging that he knew her true identity, describing specific details about their previous encounter that could only have come from someone who had been present during the operation that led to his capture. He explained that his imprisonment had been temporary, that certain political developments had necessitated his release as part of larger diplomatic negotiations, and that he had spent considerable time and resources tracking down the operative responsible for disrupting his business interests. The arms dealer's tone was conversational rather than threatening, almost friendly in its casual acknowledgement of the professional nature of their previous conflict. He expressed admiration for the skill with which Jessica had infiltrated his organization, praised her ability to maintain her cover identity despite intense scrutiny, and acknowledged that her success had cost him both significant financial losses and considerable damage to his reputation among clients who demanded discretion and security from their suppliers. But beneath the veneer of professional respect lay clear implications about his intentions regarding their unfinished business. Volkov's message concluded with specific references to Jessica's current location and family circumstances that demonstrated the depth of his intelligence-gathering capabilities. He mentioned Rebecca by name, described the layout of the Martinez ranch with accuracy that suggested recent surveillance, and referenced local events, including the grain silo incident, in ways that made it clear he understood both the immediate situation and its broader implications. His final paragraph was a simple invitation to meet at a location of her choosing, ostensibly to discuss business opportunities, but clearly intended as the opening move in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The third message in Jessica's encrypted communications came from an address that she didn't recognize, routed through proxy servers that made its origin impossible to trace using conventional methods. The sender identified himself only as a friend and claimed to represent interests that were sympathetic to her current predicament. The message suggested that powerful forces were moving against her, that her conflict with local law enforcement had provided cover for more dangerous enemies to emerge from hiding, and that she would need assistance from unexpected sources if she hoped to protect both herself and her family from the storm that was gathering around them. This anonymous correspondent claimed to have information about the federal agents who had visited the ranch, suggesting that they were not legitimate government investigators, but rather private contractors working for organizations with their own agendas regarding former special operations personnel. The message included photographic evidence that appeared to show the same three men conducting surveillance operations at other locations, always targeting individuals with classified military backgrounds who had attempted to return to civilian life after completing sensitive missions overseas. The anonymous message concluded with an offer of assistance that came with no apparent strings attached, promising resources and intelligence that could help Jessica navigate the complex web of threats that were converging on Cedar Falls. The sender claimed to represent a network of former military and intelligence personnel who had recognized a growing threat to veterans of classified operations, individuals who found themselves targeted by foreign enemies, criminal organizations, and even elements within their own government who viewed them as potential security risks rather than honored veterans, deserving of protection and support. Jessica's analysis of these communications revealed patterns that suggested coordination between seemingly unrelated threats, a convergence of interests that transformed her personal conflict with Kyle Richardson into something far more dangerous and complex. The timing of the federal visit, the speed with which her identity had been compromised, and the sudden appearance of communications from foreign adversaries suggested that someone with access to highly classified information was orchestrating events in ways designed to flush her out of hiding and force her into a position where she could be eliminated or captured. The psychological pressure of maintaining operational security while protecting her family created stresses that Jessica had not experienced even during the most dangerous phases of her military career. In combat zones, she had possessed clear authority to use whatever force was necessary to neutralize threats and complete her missions. In the civilized environment of rural Montana, she was constrained by laws and social expectations that limited her options while providing no meaningful protection against enemies who operated outside those same constraints. Rebecca's presence in the house represented both Jessica's greatest motivation and her most significant vulnerability. A beloved family member whose safety had to be protected, but whose very existence provided leverage that could be used against her by enemies who understood the importance of emotional connections in motivating their targets. The knowledge that her sister could become collateral damage in conflicts that had nothing to do with the peaceful life she had chosen to build in their mountain valley filled Jessica with a protective fury that bordered on the homicidal rage she had learned to channel against America's enemies in foreign lands. The secure communications network that connected Jessica to her military past also provided access to intelligence resources that remained available to personnel with appropriate clearances and operational justifications. Her queries into the backgrounds of the federal agents who had visited the ranch revealed disturbing inconsistencies in their credentials, suggesting that they were indeed private contractors working for organizations that operated in the gray areas between legitimate government activities and criminal enterprises. Further investigation revealed connections to defense contractors who specialized in providing services that government agencies could not officially acknowledge or support. Additional research into Anton Volkov's current activities painted a picture of an international criminal who had indeed been released from custody as part of larger diplomatic negotiations, but who had not abandoned his previous business interests despite official claims that he was cooperating with international law enforcement agencies. Intelligence reports suggested that he was using his apparent cooperation as cover for rebuilding his arms-dealing network, recruiting former special operations personnel who possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to operate in high-threat environments where conventional security contractors would be ineffective. The anonymous source who had offered assistance proved more difficult to investigate, as the sophisticated routing of his communications suggested access to resources that were typically available only to major intelligence agencies or well-funded criminal organizations. The photographic evidence he had provided appeared genuine, but its implications were disturbing in ways that extended far beyond Jessica's immediate situation. If former special operations personnel were being systematically targeted by coordinated networks of private contractors and foreign criminals, then the problem was far larger than any individual case could represent. Jessica's growing understanding of the forces arrayed against her led to the realization that her options were rapidly narrowing to choices that would have seemed unthinkable when she first returned to the peaceful environment of her family's ranch. The simple desire to protect her sister from local bullies had evolved into a complex confrontation with enemies who possessed resources and capabilities that rivaled those of nation-states, adversaries who viewed her not as a retired veteran seeking peaceful civilian life, but as a valuable asset to be captured or a dangerous threat to be eliminated. The secure communication session concluded with Jessica's transmission of coded messages to contacts who might be able to provide assistance or at least early warning if the situation continued to deteriorate. Her years of special operations experience had taught her the importance of maintaining multiple contingency plans, preparing for scenarios that seemed unlikely but which could become necessary if circumstances changed more rapidly than anticipated. The peaceful mountain valley that had once represented sanctuary was transforming into a battlefield where the stakes extended far beyond personal safety to encompass the security of her family and potentially other veterans who found themselves in similar circumstances. As dawn approached over the peaks of the Continental Divide, Jessica Martinez made the difficult decision to prepare for war while hoping for peace, gathering resources and formulating plans that could protect her family while avoiding the kind of widespread violence that would inevitably draw even more dangerous attention to their isolated community. The young woman who had once dreamed of nothing more complicated than raising cattle and helping her sister pursue her artistic ambitions was being forced to become phantom once again. But this time the mission was personal in ways that made failure unthinkable and victory potentially more costly than defeat. Part 4. Foundation Building. The Martinez family had weathered 3 generations of hardships in the unforgiving landscape of western Montana, their ranch carved from wilderness that had tested the resolve of countless dreamers who lacked the combination of stubborn determination and practical wisdom necessary to thrive in a land where nature showed no mercy to the unprepared. Jessica's great-grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had arrived in the territory during the early years of the 20th century with nothing but a handful of silver dollars sewn into the lining of his coat and an unshakable belief that honest work could build something lasting from the raw materials of mountain stone and timber. The original homestead had consisted of little more than a one-room log cabin and a lean-to shelter for the handful of cattle that represented Miguel's entire investment in the future of his family line. The first winters had been brutal beyond imagination, testing his resolve with temperatures that dropped 40 degrees below zero and snowfalls that could isolate the ranch for months at a time. But Miguel had possessed the kind of practical intelligence that comes from growing up in poverty, along with the physical strength that had been forged through years of manual labor in copper mines where a single mistake could end a man's life in an instant. By the time Miguel's son Eduardo inherited the property, The ranch had grown to encompass several hundred acres of grazing land along with timber holdings that provided both construction materials and supplemental income during the lean years when cattle prices failed to cover operating expenses. Eduardo had added his own innovations to the family enterprise, including the construction of irrigation systems that captured snowmelt from the high peaks and channeled it through a network of ditches and ponds that could sustain livestock even during the driest summers that periodically plagued the region. Robert Martinez had taken over the ranch during the turbulent economic conditions of the 1980s, when agricultural commodity prices collapsed and many family operations were forced into bankruptcy by debt loads that could not be sustained. Through the lean years that followed boom periods of artificial prosperity, his survival had required innovations that went beyond traditional ranching practices, including diversification into hunting guide services for wealthy urbanites seeking authentic wilderness experiences and the development of specialty beef markets that commanded premium prices from restaurants in distant cities. The ranch that Jessica and Rebecca had inherited as their birthright represented the accumulated wisdom and sacrifice of 3 generations, but it also carried obligations that extended far beyond simple property ownership. Every fence post had been set by hand, every building constructed with materials that had been hauled across difficult terrain by men who understood that shortcuts in construction meant catastrophic failures during the harsh winters that defined survival in their mountain valley. The land itself had been improved through decades of careful stewardship, with pastures cleared of stones and scrub brush, water sources developed and protected, and soil quality enhanced through rotation practices that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. The relationship between the Martinez family and their neighbors in Cedar Falls had been built on mutual respect and practical cooperation, the kind of interdependence that developed naturally in isolated communities where everyone understood that survival sometimes depended on the willingness of strangers to provide assistance during emergencies. Robert Martinez had participated in volunteer fire departments, search and rescue operations, and the informal networks of mutual aid that helped families weather the personal and economic disasters that could destroy individual households, but which the community as a whole could absorb and overcome. Jessica's childhood memories were filled with images of neighbors gathering for barn raisings, harvest celebrations, and the kind of community events that bound rural populations together through shared experiences and common purposes. She remembered riding in the back of pickup trucks during summer parades, participating in 4-H competitions that taught practical skills while building friendships that were expected to last a lifetime, and attending church services where theological discussions were secondary to the social connections that helped isolated families maintain their sanity during the long winter months when travel was impossible and entertainment was limited to whatever could be created from local resources. Rebecca's artistic sensibilities had been nurtured by this environment in ways that urban children could rarely experience, as she learned to find beauty in landscapes that changed erratically with the seasons and weather, patterns that transformed familiar terrain into alien vistas overnight. Her early paintings had captured the innocent wonder of a child who saw magic in the dance of sunlight across snow-covered meadows, the geometric patterns created by fence lines against the backdrop of distant peaks, and the subtle color variations that marked the transition from winter's harsh monochrome to spring's explosion of wildflower diversity. The twins had grown up with responsibilities that would have seemed overwhelming to children raised in more protective environments, but which were simply accepted as normal parts of life in a working ranch operation. They had learned to handle livestock before they were old enough to attend school, to operate machinery that could maim or kill the careless, and to make life or death decisions about injured animals that required immediate treatment or humane euthanasia. These experiences had built character traits that served them well in different ways, with Rebecca developing the empathy and attention to detail that informed her artistic vision while Jessica acquired the decisiveness and comfort with violence that would later prove essential to her military career. The educational opportunities available in Cedar Falls were limited by the practical constraints of geography and economics, but they were supplemented by the kind of real-world learning that came from living in an environment where abstract knowledge had to be applied to concrete problems on a daily basis. Jessica had excelled in mathematics because she needed to calculate feed requirements, medication dosages, and the complex logistics of moving livestock across seasonal grazing areas. Rebecca had developed her understanding of chemistry through the practical arts of developing photographs in the makeshift darkroom she had constructed in a corner of the barn, mixing chemicals with the precision of a laboratory technician while creating images that captured the essence of their mountain home. The isolation that defined rural life in western Montana also provided freedoms that were unknown to children in more populated areas, as the Martinez twins had learned to explore thousands of acres of wilderness without adult supervision, developing navigation skills and survival instincts that most people never had the opportunity to acquire. Jessica had become an expert tracker and hunter, able to read signs in the landscape that told stories about the movements of both wildlife and humans through terrain that appeared empty to less experienced observers. Rebecca had discovered hidden valleys and secret meadows that became the subjects of paintings that captured the intimate beauty of landscapes that few people would ever see. The social dynamics of their small community had been shaped by economic realities that forced cooperation among families whose political and religious differences might have created divisions in more populous areas where such cooperation was not essential to survival. The Martinez family had maintained friendly relationships with neighbors whose views on everything from taxation to environmental protection were diametrically opposed to their own, because practical considerations outweighed ideological purity when it came to sharing equipment, providing emergency assistance, and maintaining the informal networks of mutual support that made isolated rural life possible. Jessica's decision to leave Cedar Falls had been motivated by a restlessness that seemed to be genetic among the Martinez women, a need to test herself against challenges that could not be found within the familiar boundaries of their mountain valley. Her great-grandmother had been known for her wanderlust, taking extended trips to distant cities, despite the difficulties of travel during the early decades of the 20th century. Her grandmother had shocked the community by attending college during an era when higher education for women was considered both unnecessary and potentially dangerous to their prospects for marriage and family life. The military recruiter who had visited the high school during Jessica's senior year had painted pictures of adventure and service that appealed to her desire for purpose beyond the routine cycles of ranch life, but he had also been honest about the demands and dangers that would be required of anyone seeking to excel in special operations. Jessica's physical conditioning, already exceptional by civilian standards due to years of ranch work and wilderness exploration, had provided a foundation that many recruits lacked, but the mental toughness required for elite military service had been tested through challenges that pushed her far beyond anything she had experienced in Montana. Rebecca's choice to remain in Cedar Falls had been driven by different motivations, as she found inspiration in the familiar landscapes that had shaped her artistic vision since childhood. Her paintings had evolved from simple representations of scenic beauty to more complex explorations of the relationships between human activities and natural systems, documenting the ways in which 3 generations of ranch management had shaped the land while being shaped by it in return. Her work had begun to attract attention from galleries in larger cities, but she had resisted offers to relocate to environments that might provide greater commercial opportunities at the cost of severing her connection to the landscapes that inspired her creativity. The family dynamics that had sustained the Martinez household through decades of economic uncertainty and personal challenges had been built on foundations of mutual respect and shared responsibility, rather than the rigid hierarchies that characterized some rural families. Robert and Maria had raised their daughters to think independently while remaining committed to family welfare, encouraging them to pursue their individual talents while maintaining the strong emotional bonds that would survive geographical separation and the inevitable changes that came with maturation into adulthood. The ranch operation itself had evolved to reflect the personalities and capabilities of each family member, with Robert handling the heavy machinery and livestock management that required physical strength and mechanical aptitude, Maria managing the complex financial and administrative aspects of a modern agricultural business, and the twins contributing specialized skills that enhanced the overall efficiency and profitability of the enterprise. Part 3. The Intrigue Hook continued. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered pastures of the Martinez Ranch, but the peaceful facade of rural Montana life could no longer mask the deadly undercurrents that were transforming their mountain valley into a battlefield, where past and present collided with devastating force. Jessica stood at the edge of the timber line, using high-powered binoculars to scan the access roads that wound through the foothills leading to their property. Her training in counter-surveillance had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of professional observation, and what she was seeing through the magnified lenses confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the threat that was converging on her family sanctuary. 3 separate observation posts had been established in the hills surrounding the ranch, positioned with the kind of tactical precision that could only come from individuals with extensive military or intelligence experience. The observers were using equipment that reflected capabilities far beyond those of local law enforcement or even typical federal agencies, suggesting that the resources being deployed against her were commensurate with those used in overseas operations against high-value targets. The implications were chilling, as they indicated that whoever was orchestrating this surveillance operation viewed the Martinez family as threats worthy of the kind of attention typically reserved for international terrorists or enemy combatants. The encrypted communications device, hidden in Jessica's jacket, vibrated with an incoming message that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the forces arrayed against her. The transmission originated from a source she had never encountered before, but the authentication codes embedded in the signal indicated clearance levels that existed only within the most sensitive compartments of military intelligence operations. The sender identified himself as Major General Harrison Webb, a name that Jessica recognized from classified briefings as one of the architects of modern special operations doctrine, and a man whose influence extended across multiple agencies and international partnerships. Webb's message was direct and unambiguous in its assessment of the situation developing around Cedar Falls. He explained that Jessica's presence in Montana had been flagged by monitoring systems designed to track former special operations personnel who might represent security risks or potential assets for recruitment by foreign intelligence services. The confrontation with Kyle Richardson had provided cover for the deployment of surveillance assets that were normally used in overseas operations, creating a perfect storm of official attention that threatened to expose classified programs and endanger other veterans whose identities were supposed to remain buried in the bureaucratic maze of national security classifications. More disturbing still was Webb's revelation that the surveillance operation was not being conducted by any single agency, but rather represented a convergence of interests among multiple organizations that normally operated in distinct spheres of influence. Elements within the Central Intelligence Agency were concerned about the potential compromise of assets who had been involved in operations that remained classified. At the highest levels, the Defense Intelligence Agency was investigating possible security breaches that might have exposed the identities of personnel involved in programs that officially did not exist. Even the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened inquiries into domestic activities that might represent foreign intelligence operations or terrorist recruitment efforts. The Major General's message concluded with an offer of assistance that came with strings attached in ways that Jessica found deeply troubling. Webb explained that he possessed the authority to provide protection for the Martinez family, but only if Jessica agreed to participate in a classified operation that would require her to use her unique skills and knowledge in service to national security interests that he was not authorized to discuss through unsecured communications. The choice he presented was stark: accept his protection and return to the world of covert operations, or attempt to handle the current crisis using only her own resources while facing enemies who possessed capabilities that rivaled those of nation-states. Jessica's response to Webb's offer was delayed by the need to conduct her own investigation into his background and current activities, using intelligence resources that remained available to her despite her separation from active duty. What she discovered painted a picture of a career military officer whose dedication to national security had led him into increasingly gray areas where traditional concepts of law and morality became subordinate to operational necessities that were justified by classified threats that the general public was not authorized to know existed. Webb's current assignment involved oversight of programs that recruited former special operations personnel for activities that could not be officially acknowledged by any government agency. The investigation revealed that Webb's organization had been tracking Jessica since her separation from the Navy, maintaining surveillance that was designed to be undetectable while gathering intelligence about her activities, associations, and psychological state. The file that had been compiled on her activities included details about her family relationships, her attempts to readjust to civilian life, and assessments of her potential value for future operations that might require her specific combination of skills and psychological profile. The realization that her privacy had been systematically violated for years filled Jessica with a rage that she struggled to control while maintaining the operational discipline necessary to analyze the threat objectively. Additional research into Webb's organization revealed connections to defense contractors who specialized in providing services that government agencies could not officially perform, including surveillance operations against American citizens, recruitment activities that bordered on coercion, and training programs that prepared personnel for missions that violated both domestic and international law. The legal justifications for these activities were based on interpretations of national security legislation that had been classified to prevent public scrutiny, creating a parallel system of governance that operated outside the constitutional constraints that were supposed to limit government power. The scope of Webb's operations extended far beyond Jessica's individual case, encompassing a network of former special operations personnel who had been identified as potential assets for recruitment into programs that exploited their skills, while providing them with legal protection from the consequences of their previous classified activities. Many of these veterans had struggled with the transition to civilian life, facing psychological challenges and practical difficulties that made them vulnerable to recruitment by organizations that offered purpose and financial security in exchange for their continued service in the shadows of official policy. Jessica's analysis of the surveillance reports that had been compiled about her family revealed the depth of intelligence gathering that had been conducted without their knowledge or consent. The observers had documented Rebecca's daily routines, identified her artistic subjects and techniques, and assessed her potential value as leverage that could be used to influence Jessica's decisions about cooperation with Webb's organization. Similar intelligence had been gathered about Robert and Maria Martinez, including financial records, medical information, and social relationships that could be exploited to create pressure points for manipulation or coercion. The federal agents who had visited the ranch were revealed to be contractors working for one of Webb's subsidiary organizations, conducting what was officially described as a security assessment, but which was actually a recruitment interview designed to evaluate Jessica's psychological state and willingness to return to active operations. Their questions had been carefully constructed to probe for information about her current capabilities, her emotional attachments to civilian life, and her potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure her cooperation with classified programs that required her specific expertise. The convergence of multiple threats around the Martinez family was not coincidental, but rather represented a coordinated effort to force Jessica into a position where she would have no choice but to accept Webb's protection and return to the world of covert operations that she had hoped to leave behind forever. The timing of Anton Volkov's emergence, the escalation of local law enforcement harassment, and the deployment of federal surveillance assets had been orchestrated to create a crisis that could only be resolved through Jessica's cooperation with intelligence agencies that viewed her as a valuable asset rather than a retired veteran entitled to peaceful civilian life. The psychological pressure of maintaining operational security while protecting her family created stresses that tested even Jessica's exceptional mental discipline, as she found herself caught between competing loyalties that pulled her in directions that seemed mutually exclusive. Her desire to protect Rebecca, Robert, and Maria required her to consider options that would compromise the peaceful life she had fought to build, while her commitment to the principles that had motivated her military service demanded resistance to recruitment efforts that represented corruption of the ideals she had sworn to defend. The encrypted communication from the anonymous source who had offered assistance proved to be equally complex in its implications, as additional investigation revealed connections to a network of former intelligence operatives who had become disillusioned with the increasingly authoritarian tendencies of the agencies they had once served with distinction. This group, which operated under the informal designation Constitutional Patriots, represented a loose alliance of individuals who possessed inside knowledge about classified programs that violated both legal and ethical boundaries, while claiming justification through national security imperatives that were themselves classified beyond public scrutiny. The leader of this organization was revealed to be former CIA Deputy Director Margaret Chun, a career intelligence officer whose resignation had been prompted by her refusal to participate in domestic surveillance operations that she believed violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. Chun's network included former operatives from multiple agencies who shared her concerns about the increasing militarization of intelligence activities and the erosion of legal constraints that had traditionally limited government power over civilian populations. Chun's message to Jessica included intelligence about Webb's organization that painted a disturbing picture of recruitment practices that bordered on kidnapping, training programs that incorporated torture techniques previously used against foreign prisoners, and operational missions that targeted American citizens whose activities were deemed threatening to national security interests that were defined by unelected officials operating in complete secrecy. The Constitutional Patriots had documented numerous cases of former military personnel who had been recruited into these programs under false pretenses, only to find themselves trapped in situations where refusal to participate could result in prosecution under espionage laws or simply disappearance into the same black sites that were officially used to hold foreign terrorists. The offer of assistance from Chun's organization came with its own complications, as accepting their help would require Jessica to commit to activities that could be defined as domestic terrorism or treason by the same agencies that were currently trying to recruit her for their own purposes. The Constitutional Patriots operated outside the law by necessity, using intelligence gathering and operational techniques that violated numerous federal statutes while claiming moral justification through their commitment to defending constitutional principles that they believed were under attack by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Jessica's growing understanding of the forces that were converging on her family led to the realization that there were no simple solutions to the crisis that was developing around them, no clear lines between right and wrong that could guide her decisions about how to proceed. Every potential course of action carried risks that extended far beyond her personal safety, potentially affecting the security of other veterans, the integrity of constitutional government, and the safety of innocent civilians who had no knowledge of the classified conflicts that were being fought in the shadows of official policy. The secure communication session that Jessica conducted as dawn broke over the Continental Divide represented a turning point in her understanding of the situation that was developing around Cedar Falls, as she realized that her confrontation with Kyle Richardson had been merely the catalyst for a much larger conflict that had been building for years between competing visions of American democracy and national security. The peaceful mountain valley that had once represented sanctuary was becoming the focal point for a shadow war between agencies that claimed to serve the same government while pursuing objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with each other. The choice that faced Jessica Martinez was not simply about protecting her family from immediate threats, but about deciding which side she would support in a conflict that would determine the future of American democracy and the constitutional principles that had motivated her decision to serve her country in the first place. The skills that had made her an exceptional special operations warrior would be tested in ways that she had never anticipated, as she prepared to fight not against foreign enemies, but against the corruption that had infected the very institutions she had sworn to defend. Part 4. Foundation Building continued. The history that connected the Martinez family to the land they had worked for 3 generations was written in the scars and improvements that marked every acre of their mountain sanctuary, from the hand-built stone walls that channeled snowmelt through irrigation systems designed by men who understood that water was life in the arid landscape of western Montana, to the timber-framed barns that had weathered decades of storms through construction techniques that prioritized durability over convenience. Jessica's return to this landscape after 6 years of absence had awakened memories that went deeper than conscious recollection, muscle memory and emotional connections that linked her to ancestors whose bones rested in the small cemetery that overlooked the valley from a rise where ancient pines provided eternal shade for weathered headstones that bore names in languages that few residents of Cedar Falls could still read. The ranch buildings themselves told stories of adaptation and survival through boom and bust cycles that had claimed many neighboring operations, with additions and modifications that reflected the changing needs of successive generations while maintaining the architectural integrity that came from using local materials and traditional construction methods. The original homestead cabin, built by Miguel Martinez during the harsh winter of 1902, still stood at the heart of the complex as a testament to the vision and determination that had established the family's foothold in wilderness that had defeated less prepared settlers. Its log walls, chinked with a mixture of clay and moss that had been gathered from the forest floors, continued to provide weatherproof shelter that required only minimal maintenance despite having endured over a century of temperature extremes and moisture cycles that would have destroyed conventional construction. The main house, constructed during the prosperous years following World War II when beef prices reflected the protein-hungry demands of a growing nation, represented Eduardo Martinez's commitment to providing his family with modern conveniences while maintaining connection to the practical traditions that had enabled their survival during the lean years of the Great Depression. Its stone foundation had been quarried from the same granite outcroppings that provided the raw material for the irrigation systems that transformed seasonal watercourses into reliable sources of life-sustaining moisture throughout the growing season. The walls, framed with timber that had been cut from their own forests and milled at the sawmill that once operated in Cedar Falls, were insulated with materials that provided protection against winter temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero while maintaining the breathability necessary to prevent moisture problems that plague houses built with synthetic materials. The barns and outbuildings that surrounded the main residence reflected the diverse requirements of a modern ranch operation that had evolved far beyond the simple cattle raising that had sustained Miguel Martinez during the early years of the 20th century. The hay barn, with its soaring roof designed to accommodate the mechanical equipment that had revolutionized agricultural productivity, contained storage capacity that could feed their livestock through winters that sometimes lasted from October through May. Its construction incorporated lessons learned from fires that had destroyed similar structures on neighboring ranches, with electrical systems that met modern safety standards while maintaining the rustic appearance that preserved the visual integrity of the historic ranch complex. The equipment shed that housed tractors, trucks, and specialized machinery represented Robert Martinez's recognition that survival in contemporary agriculture required significant capital investment in technology that could maximize efficiency while minimizing labor costs that had become prohibitive for family operations competing against corporate agricultural enterprises. The building's design provided climate-controlled storage that protected millions of dollars worth of equipment from the moisture and temperature fluctuations that could cause catastrophic mechanical failures during critical periods when breakdowns could mean the difference between profitable and disastrous harvest seasons. The workshop where Robert maintained and repaired the complex machinery that modern ranching required had become a center of innovation where practical problems were solved through the kind of hands-on engineering that characterized rural communities, where professional repair services were hours away and equipment failures could not wait for convenient scheduling of outside assistance. The building contained tools and equipment that ranged from traditional blacksmithing apparatus that could fabricate replacement parts for vintage machinery to computerized diagnostic equipment that could troubleshoot the electronic systems that controlled modern agricultural implements. Rebecca's art studio, converted from a grain storage building that had outlived its original purpose when changing agricultural practices eliminated the need for on-farm grain storage, represented the family's commitment to supporting creative pursuits that might not contribute directly to ranch operations, but which enriched their lives in ways that could not be measured in economic terms. The space had been carefully modified to provide the natural lighting that was essential for color-accurate painting, with windows positioned to capture the subtle variations in mountain light that changed dramatically with seasons and weather patterns. The heating system that kept the studio comfortable during winter months when temperatures could remain below freezing for weeks at a time had been designed to maintain consistent conditions that prevented damage to paintings and art supplies while minimizing energy costs that could quickly become prohibitive during periods of extreme cold. The ranch's water systems represented the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of men who understood that reliable access to clean water was the foundation upon which all other ranch operations depended, from livestock production to fire protection to the domestic needs of the family that made their home in a landscape where municipal services were unavailable and self-sufficiency was not optional but essential for survival. The network of springs, wells, ponds, and distribution systems that provided water throughout the ranch had been developed through careful observation of seasonal patterns and geological features that determined where water could be found and how it could be captured and stored for use during the dry periods that were an inevitable part of the natural cycle in their mountain environment. The primary water source for the ranch was a series of springs that emerged from granite formations high in the mountains that formed the western boundary of their property, fed by snowfields that accumulated during winter storms and released their stored moisture gradually throughout the growing season. The springs had been developed through careful engineering that protected the water quality while maximizing the flow rates that could be sustained during drought periods when many neighboring ranches were forced to haul water from distant sources. The distribution system that carried spring water to Tucafodu, various points throughout the ranch, included both gravity-fed systems that required no external energy and pumped systems that could deliver water to elevated storage tanks that provided pressure for domestic use and fire protection. The irrigation systems that supported hay production and pasture improvement had been designed to make maximum use of the limited water resources available while providing flexibility to adjust to changing conditions that could vary dramatically from year to year depending on snowpack levels and precipitation patterns that were influenced by weather systems that originated thousands of miles away. The network of ditches, pipes, and control structures that distributed water across hundreds of acres of cultivated land represented not only significant financial investment, but also intimate knowledge of soil types, slope gradients, and crop requirements that had been accumulated through decades of experimentation and observation. The livestock facilities that housed and protected the cattle, that were the primary source of income for the ranch operation, had been designed to provide comfort and safety for animals while maximizing efficiency for the humans who cared for them on a daily basis throughout the year. The main barn, with its concrete floors and steel construction, could shelter the entire herd during storms that made outdoor survival impossible, while providing easy access for feeding, medical treatment, and handling operations that were necessary components of modern cattle management. The facility included specialized areas for calving, veterinary procedures, and equipment storage that reflected the complex requirements of maintaining healthy livestock in an environment where professional services were limited and self-reliance was essential. The corrals and handling facilities that were used for working cattle incorporated design principles that recognized both the physical capabilities of the animals and the safety requirements of the humans who worked with them, featuring sturdy construction that could withstand the tremendous forces generated by frightened or agitated livestock while providing multiple escape routes for workers who might find themselves in dangerous situations. The systems had been refined through years of experience that taught hard lessons about the unpredictable nature of large animals and the importance of preparation for emergency situations that could develop without warning. The fencing systems that controlled livestock movement and protected property boundaries represented a significant investment in both materials and labor that had to be maintained continuously to remain effective against animals that were naturally inclined to test every weakness in the barriers that confined them. The ranch used a combination of traditional barbed wire, modern electric fencing, and strategic placement of gates and cattle guards that allowed efficient movement of livestock while preventing their escape onto neighboring properties or public roads, where they could cause accidents or damage that would result in significant legal and financial liability. The hay fields that provided winter feed for the livestock had been developed through decades of soil improvement, drainage projects, and careful selection of grass varieties that could thrive in the challenging climate conditions that characterized their mountain location. The fields represented not only significant financial investment, but also intimate knowledge of local growing conditions that had been accumulated through trial and error over multiple generations of ranch management. The irrigation systems that supported hay production had been designed to provide uniform water distribution while conserving the precious water resources that were essential for ranch operations throughout the growing season. The forest lands that comprised nearly half of the ranch's total acreage provided both economic opportunities and management challenges that required specialized knowledge of timber production, wildlife habitat requirements, and fire prevention strategies that were essential for protecting both ranch infrastructure and neighboring properties from the catastrophic wildfires that were an ever-present threat in their dry mountain environment. The family had developed relationships with forestry professionals who could provide expertise about sustainable timber harvesting, habitat improvement projects, and fire management strategies that balanced economic objectives with environmental stewardship responsibilities. The road systems that provided access throughout the ranch had been developed to accommodate everything from daily ranch operations to emergency services that might need to reach remote areas during medical emergencies or fire suppression activities. The network included both improved roads that could handle heavy equipment and seasonal access routes that were designed to minimize environmental impact while providing necessary access to areas that required periodic management attention. Maintenance of these roads represented a significant, ongoing expense that had to be balanced against the operational benefits they provided and the legal requirements for providing access to utility companies and emergency services. The ranch's electrical and communication systems had been designed to provide reliable service in an environment where commercial utilities were expensive and often unreliable due to the extreme weather conditions and challenging terrain that characterized their mountain location. The family had invested in backup power generation capabilities that could maintain essential operations during extended outages that were common during winter storms, along with communication systems that could function when conventional telephone and internet services were disrupted by weather or equipment failures. Part 5. The Absence Mystery. The 6 years that Jessica Martinez had spent away from Cedar Falls remained shrouded in carefully constructed ambiguity that protected both her classified service record and her family's peace of mind, creating a gap in the community's understanding that had been filled with speculation ranging from romantic adventure to criminal involvement to tragic accident that had left her changed in ways that were visible to anyone who possessed the experience to recognize the subtle signs of psychological trauma and specialized training. The official story that she had shared with her parents involved restaurant work in various cities, temporary employment that had allowed her to explore different parts of the country while developing skills that might prove useful in managing the hospitality aspects of their ranch operation. The truth about Jessica's absence was contained in classified files that documented her progression from basic military training through the increasingly demanding selection processes that filtered candidates for special operations assignments, eliminating those who lacked either the physical capabilities or the psychological resilience necessary to function effectively in the high-stress environments where elite military units conducted their most sensitive missions. Her initial enlistment in the Navy had been motivated by genuine patriotism and a desire to serve her country, but her rapid advancement through training programs that were designed to identify exceptional candidates had led to opportunities that she could never have anticipated when she first signed her enlistment contract in the recruiter's office in Missoula. The basic underwater demolition SEAL training that had transformed Jessica from an enthusiastic recruit into a hardened warrior had tested every aspect of her character through physical and psychological challenges that were designed to simulate the extreme conditions that special operations personnel faced in combat environments, where failure meant death, not only for themselves but for the teammates who depended on their performance. The training had taken place in locations ranging from the frigid waters of the Pacific Ocean to desert environments that replicated the conditions found in Middle Eastern combat zones, each phase designed to develop specific capabilities while building the mental toughness that enabled elite warriors to function effectively under pressure that would incapacitate ordinary individuals. The selection process for assignment to Development Group, the Navy's most elite special operations unit, had involved additional testing that went beyond the already demanding requirements of basic SEAL training, evaluating candidates for psychological stability, cultural adaptability, and the kind of moral flexibility that was necessary for personnel who might be required to operate in situations where traditional rules of engagement were insufficient guides for making life and death decisions. Jessica's performance during these evaluations had impressed instructors who had seen thousands of candidates attempt to meet the standards required for acceptance into programs that officially did not exist and whose activities were classified at levels that prevented public scrutiny of their methods or objectives. Her first operational deployment had taken place in Afghanistan during the height of American military involvement in that country's complex tribal conflicts, where she had served as part of a team tasked with gathering intelligence about Taliban leadership structures and disrupting supply networks that supported insurgent activities against coalition forces. The mission had required her to develop language skills and cultural knowledge that enabled her to operate in disguise among populations that were hostile to American presence, conducting surveillance and recruitment activities that provided valuable intelligence while maintaining cover identities that could withstand scrutiny from suspicious local authorities. The psychological demands of maintaining false identities while conducting dangerous operations in foreign countries had tested Jessica's mental resilience in ways that civilian life could never replicate, requiring her to compartmentalize her emotions and suppress natural human responses to violence and deception that were necessary components of successful intelligence gathering. The training that had prepared her for these challenges had included instruction in interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, and the kind of emotional detachment that enabled operatives to form relationships with targets who would ultimately be betrayed or eliminated as operational requirements dictated. Her success in Afghanistan had led to increasingly demanding assignments that took her to countries where American military presence was not officially acknowledged, conducting missions that required her to operate without the legal protections and support systems that were available to conventional military personnel. These operations had included infiltration of criminal organizations in Eastern Europe, surveillance of suspected terrorist cells in Western Europe, and direct action missions in Africa, where she had participated in the elimination of high-value targets whose activities threatened American interests or allies. The code name Phantom that Jessica had earned during these operations reflected her exceptional ability to move through hostile environments without detection, conducting surveillance and reconnaissance missions that provided critical intelligence while remaining invisible to enemy security systems that were designed to detect and eliminate foreign operatives. Her techniques for maintaining cover identities and avoiding detection had been studied and incorporated into training programs for other special operations personnel, though her natural talents for deception and infiltration remained exceptional, even among the elite community of individuals who possessed security clearances that authorized access to the most sensitive intelligence programs. The psychological toll of years spent living false identities while conducting operations that required her to commit acts of violence and deception had accumulated in ways that were not immediately apparent, but which had fundamentally altered her relationship with civilian life and normal social interactions. The hypervigilance and paranoia that were essential survival traits in hostile foreign environments had become ingrained habits that made it difficult for her to relax and trust people who had not been vetted through the kind of security investigations that were standard procedure for individuals with access to classified information. Her final mission, which had taken place in Syria during the chaotic period when that country's civil war had created opportunities for terrorist organizations to establish training camps and weapons storage facilities, had involved the infiltration of an arms-dealing network that was supplying advanced weapons to groups that posed direct threats to American personnel and allies throughout the Middle East. The operation had required her to assume the identity of a weapons dealer herself, participating in transactions that violated numerous international laws while gathering intelligence that would enable coalition forces to disrupt the supply networks that supported terrorist activities. The moral complexity of conducting operations that required her to facilitate the transfer of weapons that would be used to kill innocent civilians had created psychological conflicts that were difficult to resolve. Through the rationalization techniques that had been included in her training for dealing with the ethical ambiguities that were inherent in covert operations. The knowledge that her actions as an undercover operative had indirectly contributed to violence against civilian populations had created feelings of guilt and responsibility that were compounded by the classified nature of her activities, which prevented her from seeking counseling or support from mental health professionals who lacked the security clearances necessary to discuss the details of her experiences. The decision to end her special operations career had been prompted by an incident during her final mission in Syria, where she had been forced to eliminate a target who turned out to be an intelligence asset working for another American agency, a mistake that had resulted from communication failures between organizations that were supposed to be coordinating their activities but which maintained separate operational security protocols that prevented effective information sharing. The psychological impact of killing someone who was ultimately serving the same cause that motivated her own actions had created trauma that could not be addressed through the debriefing procedures that were designed to help operatives process the emotional aftermath of successful missions. Her separation from active duty had been conducted through administrative procedures that were designed to protect both her identity and the classified programs in which she had participated, creating a service record that documented her naval career in general terms, while omitting any reference to the specific units or activities that had defined her actual military experience. The transition assistance that was provided to personnel leaving special operations included psychological counseling and career guidance, but these services were limited by security requirements that prevented discussion of the experiences that had created the need for such assistance in the first place. The medical evaluation that had been conducted as part of her separation process had documented symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychological conditions that were common among special operations personnel, but the treatment recommendations had been constrained by the classified nature of the experiences that had created these conditions. The medications that had been prescribed to help her manage anxiety and sleep disorders had provided temporary relief, but had not addressed the underlying psychological conflicts that were created by years of conducting operations that violated her personal moral code while serving causes that she continued to believe were justified by national security necessities. The financial compensation that Jessica had received upon her separation from military service had included payments that were officially described as disability benefits, but which actually represented compensation for participating in classified programs that had exposed her to psychological trauma and physical dangers that went beyond the normal risks associated with military service. These payments were structured to continue for the rest of her life, but they came with non-disclosure agreements that prevented her from discussing the circumstances that had created the need for such compensation. The monitoring that continued after her return to civilian life was officially described as routine follow-up for personnel who had been exposed to classified information, but it actually represented ongoing surveillance that was designed to ensure that former special operations personnel did not pose security risks through their civilian activities or associations. This monitoring included periodic contact with handlers who were responsible for assessing the psychological stability and potential security risks posed by individuals whose knowledge of classified programs made them valuable targets for foreign intelligence services or criminal organizations. The isolation that Jessica had experienced during her readjustment to civilian life had been compounded by the inability to share her experiences with family members or civilian friends who lacked the security clearances and life experiences necessary to understand the challenges that were created by years of conducting operations in the Fayongwangwa, moral gray areas where national security interests conflicted with traditional ethical principles. The techniques that had been developed for maintaining operational security had become barriers to forming The kind of intimate relationships that were necessary for psychological healing and successful reintegration into civilian society. The decision to return to Cedar Falls had represented Jessica's attempt to reconnect with the values and relationships that had motivated her decision to serve her country in the first place, seeking healing through the simple rhythms of ranch life and the unconditional love of family members who accepted her without requiring explanations about the experiences that had changed her in ways that were visible to anyone who possessed the knowledge to recognize the signs of specialized training in psychological trauma. The hope that she could rebuild her life around the peaceful activities of cattle ranching and family relationships had sustained her through the difficult process of readjustment to civilian life, providing purpose and direction that were missing from the aimless existence that characterized many veterans' attempts to find meaning in civilian careers that seemed trivial compared to the life and death struggles that had defined their military service. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.